Okay, so we're just going to keep this relatively informal. Anyone who doesn't want to sort of appear in the recording can just type in voice and we will read questions out where necessary. So, the structure this will take is a kind of overview of the political horizon that has surrounded the Trump campaign, Trump getting elected, and essentially what we're going to have to deal with as socialists going forward from here. And also, essentially, what is the nature of what Trump represents? What is the climate that he has come to power within? So, the first question I'd like to throw out there is on that topic. There's been this term trumpism that's gone around quite a lot in the media. What actually is trumpism? What is your definition of trumpism?
So, when I think of how people are talking about Donald Trump in the media, everything I'm saying is just this casual dismissal of whether things are true or not. It does not seem to be a concern for anyone at all. All that anyone really seems to care about is the political utility of an idea or something that is like thought to have happened, like the whole leak that happened about these supposed things that Trump had done in a Russian hotel, whatever that was. I didn't read the whole thing. I didn't really care to, because as far as I could tell, there's no real solid evidence that any of it actually happened, and everyone was fairly quick to point that out. But at the same time, it still gets passed around, and prior to that, there was the whole DNC leaks and all this stuff about the Comet ping pong pizza joint that had a guy come in with a gun because of these weird conspiracy theories on the internet. The climate I'm seeing is this whole, go back to like 1984, where it's true if the party says it's true, you know, it doesn't matter what the facts are anymore.
A lot of people spend a lot of time talking about like how we're seeing reflections of the past, and one of the most interesting ways I think we're seeing that is people using the term fake news, but it's really just yellow journalism come back, if it ever went away to begin with.
I also think one significant element of Trump's sort of rise to power was the interaction that he had with the media, where he sort of used the media as he used his own sort of outrageous actions to gain a platform on the media. I think that's sort of at the core of what people are referencing when they talk about this idea of Trumpism, is both the sort of post-truth thing that people tend to talk about, and also his own interactions with the media.
He uses the media as a punching bag too, like as an enemy, which I think is really interesting.
Especially considering it was the most significant source of his, rise to popularity.
Which just means he gets covered more.
It's just this kind of a circular pattern that happens where Trump says something outrageous and gets more media coverage, and that reinforces the behavior.
And I think just hearing this, just to add on to this, it really goes to show how, with a lot of just kind of the current mainstream media, how it is still, really not that focused on, actual policy matters at all, but it's very much focused on the personality. And even when there is a discussion of policy, there is still this air of look at how outrageous this personality is, which seems to, in a lot of ways, sort of hand wave a lot of very clear objections to, even, what Democrats have been doing, that in a lot of ways set a Trump to rise pretty much, and Republicans as well, not to forget what they contribute into all of this.
Yeah, I think it's I think that's why one of the reasons he's so successful, that he's a reality TV star, and mainstream cable news is basically reality TV. There's a really great article that Matt Taibbi wrote in the primaries that basically argued that because the mass media has been focused for so long on these like gotcha stories and like the horse race journalism and all that, that they effectively created Donald Trump, right? And that because they're so much more focused on providing entertainment than they are providing information, they're kind of complicit in what's happening.
The problem is that the incentives for the corporate media are about getting ratings, and Donald Trump gets ratings regardless of what he does or says. So they have an incentive to cover him just because people will watch him, even if he's being a complete asshole.
Yeah, and I think one thing to say as well that like really needs to be pointed out, just at least at the present moment, is that despite all of this media coverage, Trump hasn't necessarily gotten much more popular. In fact, like he has a 30% approval rating right now. He lost the popular vote by 3 million votes, but basically by the quirk of the election system, he was able to win the presidency. Trump doesn't have a mandate, yet the media definitely tries to push it as if he does, because they give him so much coverage and because it's like, you know, like train wrecks make a lot of money.
The other issue here is that the media doesn't actually, by and large, disagree that much with most of Trump's principles and policies, because they're still all just liberals in one way or another. He might have a bit more of a right-wing bent to some of his ideas, but for the most part, he's well within the scope of what they will see as acceptable, given the other Republican candidates on the field. All that they really have to cling to is being really in opposition to the mainstream liberal way of thinking. Is all this political correctness stuff, and how he has done things that are clearly rape, or at the very least sexual harassment. Those are the only things that they have to really object to.
I think it's also interesting to note there's a divide between the way Trump is covered in the print media and the way he's covered on TV news. Because if you read the way he's covered in print media, there's always more, not only more fact-checking, but also more condemnations and like opinion pages, even in conservative newspapers like the Wall Street Journal. But if you go on like Fox News or even CNN, it's just not there. That kind of criticism's not there.
I think that just comes out of, you know, the intended audiences for those two different forms of media.
Yes, the people that are sitting down and reading the Wall Street Journal are probably much more interested in hearing about or reading critique of Trump's policies, whereas people that are sitting around and watching Fox News and MSNBC all day are really just in it for the soap opera that is American politics.
Even if it is something of an empty critique when it comes from someone like the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post.
I'll just read out Miss Pavlichenko's comment here. Trump's rhetoric is just a trumped-up version of the same sort of right-wing, sensationalist garbage tabloids like the New York Post, Daily Mail, etc. have been spewing for years.
Really, decades.
That's absolutely true. And I'm not quite sure what it is that he's done that has seemed to have given it a new voice, a stronger voice that has really gotten people to just jump on the bandwagon. This stuff has been circulating for years. People like Rush Limbaugh have been spewing it for years, but it's not really picked up nearly as much conspiratorial steam on the internet.
I think the internet is part of it. And I think the other part of it is that people have less and less faith in traditional news media, like, you know, the big three networks, CNN, the major newspapers. Ever since like the 60s to 70s, there's been a declining sense of, you know, trust in those institutions. And I think as people lose trust in those, they start to turn more and more to tabloid news.
I think also for answers to that question, it would be helpful to look to a class analysis in terms of economic conditions as well. The economic situation that Trump is coming to power in is very unstable. We are still in a recession. I have heard tell that we're due another global recession. Trump, particularly, his policies, I suppose, insofar as he has them, or at least his election campaign rhetoric, has centred a lot around protectionist policies in particular, which are, I suppose, not always universal in terms of right-wing politicians, not always the sort of thing they might adopt. And it's important, I think, to ask, why would he adopt those policies or those promises? To whom is he trying to appeal?
It's an interesting question, because I don't think, to my knowledge, the Republican Party has never been a protectionist party. At least not in any of the part of its existence that I can think of.
There is a class basis to analyze this through, and it's been pretty obvious over the past couple decades, really, that most of the core manufacturing jobs that made this country so rich over the past 100 years have all vanished by and large. And then we're also coming into coming after some of the more basic industrial jobs like coal mining, things like that. Very unskilled labor is being phased out because it's either too dirty or too expensive to do in the United States. Then you have Donald Trump coming in and making huge promises that those jobs are going to be coming back. Here's a hint, they're not. And then when he says things like, oh, we're going to open up drilling in various parts of the country, or we're going to start doing more coal mining and all that kind of stuff, when it's clearly really either not going to happen, or if it does happen, it's not going to be nearly as effective as it needs to be to actually get people reemployed. Then on the horizon, we have stuff like self-driving cars coming around the corner, which is going to completely eliminate trucking as a job, and trucking covers a huge amount of the American population. And then you also see things like automated factories in a lot of these places. That is going to eliminate even more of the manufacturing sector.
And even if they do start drilling for oil again, there's already a huge oversupply of oil on the market, so they're not going to be able to sell the oil they drill.
MSFD just wrote something that I found really interesting, and I'll go ahead and read this. To ACAB's point, it'll be interesting to see the tension between his protectionism, to whatever extent he believes it, I don't think he cares, and the general push for trade liberalization by the Republican donor base and political establishment. Because, like, as of right now, I mean, Trump is going to be inaugurated, as of now, within less than 2 days. And really, because, like, you've seen now with the new Congress, like, they've repealed Obamacare right now, like they said, you know, and a lot of that was very much this sort of, like, political macho posturing of, like, look how great we are, like, repealing all of Obama's bad policies. So it's interesting, like, because now it's like we're going to see, well, Trump still needs to sign all of that, like, repealing. Like, what is he going to do? I mean, I think it's more than likely probably going to be like that he will. But if he doesn't, then that's something where that clearly shows a tension perhaps between Trump and the Republican Party. That was just something that I thought was interesting from MSFD's point.
My suspicion is that sometime before the convention, they essentially cut a deal between Paul Ryan and Donald Trump about what the priorities were going to be, and we're going to find out, you know, slowly and painfully what the terms of that deal were.
Somehow, I think the way things are going to go, as far as Congress goes, is more that it's going to quickly, the reins are going to fall out of Donald Trump's hands really quickly, and they will push things through, and it'll wind up on his desk, and if he doesn't sign it, he's going to look weak, and he can't tolerate that. He will be forced to sign it just by the virtue of the fact that it's on his desk.
I've got another question to sort of throw out there. How do we as socialists treat the diffusion of responsibility in terms of Trump as a political figure and his short and long-term political appointments? So thinking more generally than just Trump himself, to the people that he is actually appointing. Who are they? What do they represent?
So, can you guess who Donald Trump appointed cybersecurity advisor? Anyone? No? Rudy Giuliani. Now, why would he appoint Rudy Giuliani to be cybersecurity advisor? Well, it turns out Rudy Giuliani did establish a cybersecurity consulting firm a couple years ago or something. Within minutes of the announcement that he was appointing Rudy Giuliani, the website for this firm was hacked because it was running on various protocols that were way out of date, and it's just been taken completely down almost instantly. This person does not have the slightest clue about what cybersecurity actually is. Clearly doesn't have like a strong company that has any idea what to do with cybersecurity, because they couldn't even set up their own website in a secure manner. Anyone who takes the time to actually look at the qualifications and what this company is actually capable of would see that. Donald Trump doesn't care. He doesn't see that. He isn't even bothering to investigate. Rudy Giuliani is a purely political appointment. And I think any of the bad results that come from Rudy Giuliani's appointment have to rest upon the person who made the appointment, because there's plenty of evidence to see why this is a bad appointment. He's just willfully ignorant to the problems here.
I don't think it's just their political appointments. I think that for the last 30 years, there's been this ideological crusade on the part of the Republican Party to essentially dismantle large aspects of the federal government. You can see in almost every department that he's picked, except for defense, that the person he's chosen is pretty much philosophically opposed, not just unqualified, but philosophically opposed to the mission of that federal department. Like Betsy DeVos being the Secretary of Education is a great example, because she doesn't care about public education. Same thing with the EPA director not believing global warming. Or, Jeff Sessions probably not going to care too much about enforcing the Civil Rights Act. And there's an interview, and I don't know if this is a rumor or confirmed, or like a leaked video of Newt Gingrich basically saying that the object of the Trump administration was to undo the FDR government, which I think is a bit of an exaggeration, because, Newt Gingrich tends to, exaggerate stuff like that. But I think it's an important point, or an important philosophical perspective to understand that these people are opposed to the federal government doing anything.
Yeah, I would agree that it's a pretty tall order to take apart the New Deal.
One thing that just sort of popped into my head, but the thing is, like, I don't remember enough of the history of what I read. Specifically, it's like kind of comparing this to the presidency of Warren G. Harding, considering that this was a presidency in the 1920s, like very much preceding like the Great Depression, where this guy simply, took like basically hired all of his friends, and it was like very much a situation where it was very corrupt and laden with scandals. Some of them, like, I wish I could remember right now, but I can't. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to try to develop that, if that is a worthwhile discussion to have.
Like Teapot Dome?
Yeah, like Teapot Dome and stuff like that, in terms of like perhaps the sort of style of the Trump administration right now, because I feel like in some ways we have seen this before. Maybe, it isn't quite as overt because of like the fact that like Trump has a whole media machine behind them. I mean, especially because the dissemination of media is like much more rapid than it ever was in the 1920s. But I'm wondering about like the presidency of Warren G. Harding, and if that is actually any sort of like useful comparison to perhaps what we could see in the future.
Teapot Dome, for those who don't know, was an oil reserve that was owned by the U.S. Navy, and Warren G. Harding essentially went under the table to sell drilling rights into that oil reserve to private interests. Huge scandal during the administration.
Okay, I'm going to read something that MSFD said just now. Willful ignorance or intentional. Take Ben Carson. This is a guy with absolutely no experience or insight of anything having to do with housing and urban development. Why appoint him to that? Because other actors could run circles around them, to essentially rob the agency. Now, the reason I would object to that is because I don't think Donald Trump personally has that much of a conspiratorial mindset or that much forethought to think that far ahead. I think he put Ben Carson and Giuliani into political offices mainly because that they supported him in the election. I don't think he's one that smart to think so far ahead as to want the government office to be run to the ground by people that are thoroughly unqualified to run them, as much as I think it's because it's just he doesn't think about it. He just wants people that he likes in high office, and he'll just rely on the lower bureaucrats to run things.
Well, it's important to remember Trump's not the only player at the table when it comes to these appointments, right? That people around him, not only just Jared Kushner and his other advisors, but also Republicans in Congress have input on these decisions too, I think.
Do you really believe for a second that any one of the Republicans in Congress were recommending Ben Carson for housing and urban development?
Well, maybe not Carson specifically, but people like Betsy DeVos.
Sure. On the other hand, Betsy DeVos also gave Trump thousands of dollars.
This is true. This is true. She's donated, I think, $200 million to Republicans over the last decade, I think.
Right.
So, if we can just rewind for a minute, sort of back to the situation prior to the actual election, specifically around his competitors during the presidential election campaign, the question I would ask is, I mean, we had the dynamics with Sanders dropping out, essentially capitulating to Clinton, and then Clinton in the end lost. My question is, why? I mean, in previous eras, in previous decades, we have seen we've seen the Democrats win. We've seen liberals, essentially not particularly left Democrats, win the support of social movements, and it's been enough to carry them to the White House. So my question is, why wasn't it enough this time?
I think one thing is, for a while, the Republicans have known that the Democrats have wanted to run Hillary Clinton. They've wanted to run Hillary Clinton for decades now. So they've had a very deliberate program of attacking her as a political figure to ensure that she doesn't win, because the Democrats have sort of put all their eggs in a basket with Hillary Clinton as a candidate.
I want to
He's
talk
also...
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I'm gonna go on a tangent, so you go ahead.
I was just saying that honestly, most of the attacks against Clinton specifically have basically just been cultivated for decades. Like, ever since she was First Lady, just because she seemed to be quite controversial for a few reasons, but it ended up snowballing and then got especially worse when she had the state Secretary of State.
Oh, she's got a lot of self-inflicted wounds too.
Oh, absolutely.
The reason the social left was unwilling to put their support behind Hillary Clinton to any passionate degree is because they had already put their support behind Bernie Sanders, and for the better part of the year, Hillary Clinton spent that time just shitting all over Sanders. And that really alienated a lot of people. And Donald Trump echoed a good portion of some of the populism of Sanders to one degree or another. It wasn't a real echo, it was kind of just the populism without the social grounding behind it. And I think that caught a lot of people in his net.
I think most important to know more than anything of just why Hillary Clinton lost, because again, we need to remember that like Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote by a sizable margin, 3 million votes. And it was, by the way, the Electoral College is designed, that essentially, Trump is able to get like way more Electoral College votes. That being said, you then need to look at like where those states flipped. And more than anything, Trump didn't necessarily gain voters as much as Democrats and Hillary Clinton specifically lost a lot of that working class base. You only had a turnout of about 55% of the voting bloc actually come out and vote. I actually saw a picture the other day that apparently circulated like right when the election happened, which honestly I thought was really powerful. And it basically said, if not voting was a presidential candidate and not voting won like about like 408 like electoral votes. So clearly a lot of people are very disenfranchised from the political process and feel that there is like no representation for them at all.
And let's not forget, by the way, that several states have been carrying out a very concentrated campaign of voter suppression. But relating to the overall point I just posted in the chat, an article in Slate that came out right after the election, that in 5 Rust Belt states, from Obama to Clinton, the Democrats lost 1.4 million votes. And those people did not vote for Trump, they voted for no one.
That was interesting you mentioned the voter suppression thing, just because my particular home state is probably most publicly infamous for this, both because of previous court cases and related elections and just kind of similar antics, but especially now, and still continues to be particularly awful. I think at least some of you saw kind of an idea going around where there was some sort of democracy index, so to speak, that rated the state of North Carolina around a couple, like Indonesia and Sierra Leone, in terms of some sort of index.
It's important to remember, I don't think a lot of people know this, that in 2013 the Supreme Court removed several provisions from the Voting Rights Act.
Another thing I'd like to touch on this point, because it's something I've noticed, and it's something that is kind of related to an earlier subject, in regards to Hillary Clinton winning the election by almost 3 million votes. What I've seen outside of people who are really deep into like following politics is that first you have that news come out, and then you immediately have Donald Trump and his spokespeople calling that fake news. And then people who are stuck in the middle, they've heard about fake news. They've seen things on the internet and starting to realize that you can't trust things that you hear. And then this idea that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes and still won the election, it just doesn't ring true to them, because they believe in democracy, and they start doubting the facts. They doubt reality. America has been gaslighted, basically.
I mean, if you don't believe the media, it's kind of hard to believe when they say that, especially when everyone voted for Trump, or everyone voted for Clinton.
You mentioned the Voting Rights Act being stripped down a few years ago, but I was just going to comment that in North Carolina, like congressional districts wise, except like extreme cases of gerrymandering have been like kind of noticed since like the 90s when they revised it in like 1993.
I think it's worth mentioning that that the Democrats sort of aimed for winning the election with a landslide, while Republicans really set up a campaign very strategically. They sort of understood that the Democrats were going to expect to win by a landslide, and that's why I think that the Democrats won the popular vote despite not winning the Electoral College, because they didn't strategize to win the crucial Electoral College votes.
There's this really great 538 chat from October where they discuss whether or not it's smart for Hillary Clinton to play in Arizona. And it's looking back, it's just kind of funny how wrong they were about the state of the polls and about how strong her position was.
Well, that's another thing, because I saw an article a while back that was talking about how apparently, like, there were people that tried to actually volunteer for the Hillary Clinton campaign, specifically in, like, more rural areas like Michigan, Wisconsin, and whatnot. And basically the Hillary Clinton campaign refused because it went against pretty much all of, like, their data entry points and all their models and whatnot. So they're like, we don't need you right now. And it just kind of, it's just one of those things where it really went to show like that, like Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic Party as a whole was incredibly out of touch with pretty much what a lot of people have been very angry about.
I think a lot of people just assumed when they were covering the election that she would have the same level of ground game that Obama did. Which is absolutely not true.
How did the structure of the Democratic Party ensure that working class elements would and will be excluded from participation in the party program?
First off, the superdelegates worked exactly as they were intended to. So for those of you who don't know the history, in 1972, Democrats nominated George McGovern, who was very popular with like the activist college base, and he was destroyed by Richard Nixon in the election. So after that, they implemented superdelegates to prevent someone like McGovern from getting nominated again. And it worked. And then they lost the election.
One thing I'd say to that, the reason I don't really buy the whole superdelegate argument is that virtually every time I can remember, that I can think of off the top of my head, all the superdelegates have done is fluff up the numbers for the person who won the most delegates anyway, to make it look like the party was more solidly on one side than the other. We saw this with Obama. Obviously, the Democrats at the time would have preferred Hillary, I think, at least at the beginning, when he didn't have as much of a national lead as he ultimately did. And Hillary Clinton had a lot of early superdelegates behind her. But the problem with the superdelegates is really mostly become making the early front runner look inevitable in the nominating process. And they sort of act as really strong endorsements by making it look like very early on one candidate already has 100 or so more delegates than the other.
I think there's a parallel between the two parties, between the divide between the elected officials and their elite donors and the party base. And I think it's a little more evident in the Republican Party, where if you look at Republican voters have been backing these elite Rockefeller-type Republicans since probably George H.W. Bush, if not earlier. And then once they get into office, they always kind of abandon these social issues and focus on economic reforms. Or they elect Republicans into Congress who then, of course, do nothing but, play games with the debt ceiling. So in both parties, you have this divide between the base who wants radical change and the elite of both parties who want things to stay more or less the same. And the difference is that the elites in the Republican Party were dethroned and the elites in the Democratic Party were not.
And I think more simply is just when you look at how, like, politicians actually govern, they don't really spend a lot of their time actually, like, debating in committees and, like, discussing actual issues. They're actually, more often than not, trying to appeal to donors to basically help them fund for the next election. And this is something that is just so, like systemic throughout the entire system, like pretty much as a means to, like, actually have a successful campaign and, like, get that paycheck in the end. They spend a lot of their time really appealing to donors, and that's, you get like a lot. You really can't appeal to working class politics when you spend most of your time appealing to Goldman Sachs.
Or to Meryl Streep.
So I want to read something that Communist Penguin noted, is that the Democrats have always, or at least for a very long time, at least since the Voting Rights Act period, relied heavily on the minority vote without actually doing much for them, which is entirely true, and I have nothing to say to argue against that. And MSFD says that, in response to my note on the electoral, or on the superdelegates as doing the Democratic Party, is that it's a structural problem within the Democratic Party as a whole, which is true. But what my point really was is I don't think the superdelegates are ever going to contradict the results of the nomination process. Bernie Sanders did, in fact, lose regardless of whether there were superdelegates involved anyway. But the fact that the superdelegates were in there from the start and fluffed Hillary Clinton's numbers in the beginning, that's what really made it look like he was losing by much more than he actually was, and kind of suppressed voters from actually going out and thinking that he could win at some point.
I think another part of the problem is that the Democratic Party coalition is kind of incoherent. And Zizek actually wrote a great article about this in Newsweek, where he basically said that since everyone is in the Democratic Party tent, you have like Black Lives Matter on the one hand, and the CIA on the other hand, as part of the same ideological party, there's not really a lot of ideological coherence to that. And as a result, people don't show up because they know the party's not really theirs. They know they have to share the party. Occupy Wall Street has to share the Democratic Party with Goldman Sachs. A homogenous movement that lacks principle. That's a pretty good description of the Democratic Party.
I was just going to basically raise another point in relation to NATO. What do we expect will happen with NATO in regards to Trump's campaign rhetoric, i.e. refusing to fund NATO allies and defend NATO allies if attacked?
I think that this is largely just rhetoric. I think when it comes down to it, the momentum within the military-industrial complex, the momentum within, the Congress is going to prevent him from actually leaving NATO, actually, not intervening when and if NATO is called to defend a country involved with it. I really don't think that America is going to be exiting the North Atlantic Treaty anytime soon.
But the caveat to that is we may see, and I don't know how likely this is or not, an arrangement between Trump and Putin where the United States agrees that Eastern Europe is Putin's backyard, right? And then we have a return to the old spheres of influence in Europe that were kind of undone under Bush and Obama, right, when they expanded NATO in Eastern Europe.
Should American workers expect to be placed in more imperialist wars?
Yes.
Yeah, like that question. I mean, it is really speculative in that sense to say that yes, we will be in more imperialist wars, which I think just goes to say, because at least for me, I really, in a lot of ways, even like knowing like Trump's cabinet and stuff, I have no idea what the hell is actually going to happen until like we actually get the term rolling and we see like the actions of the administration in conjunction with the legislative branch, and that I mean that I feel like that in that sense that uncertainty is like really, to me, is the more like defining characteristic of like this upcoming Trump presidency. We just don't know what the hell is going to happen.
I think it's pretty easy to say that the wars we're already in are probably going to continue. and they're probably going to expand. As far as new conflicts, the only one I really think is likely to have any kind of flare up is probably China and the South China Sea.
I really think that the United States and China are too economically entangled at this point for a full-on war to blow up. I think you might see a proxy conflict around China and the United States, sort of in the way that we saw proxy conflicts with the Soviet Union. But I really doubt that we'd have full-scale conflict with China.
I'm just talking about like a naval skirmish in the South China Sea, not a full-on like World War type situation.
I'm doubting that there's going to be sort of Gulf of Tonkin type event.
Would we speculate that there might be an international echo of Trump's presidency in terms of what will Trump's relationship be to reactionary movements abroad?
Well, I can already tell you, definitely yes. We're going to be seeing things like a movement around Le Pen in France, which is horrifying. I'm sure there's others I can't think of off the top of my head, but we have seen like the British Independence Party get some support from Trump.
I mean, the Brexit thing basically kind of set the ball rolling before the election itself. But I definitely feel that Trump is going to really get that ball rolling in terms of seeing reactionary groups across the West, especially.
Le Pen will win.
Yeah.
I'm calling it right now.
Do you really
I'm
think
willing
she'll
to
win?
bet money.
I would bet money that Le Pen will win.
I will bet $20, if not more.
Of course, the question is, so what happens when Le Pen wins? Because in my imagination, that's pretty much game over for the EU, right?
Game over for NATO as well, probably.
On the other hand, the one thing I would say that France has over the United States is that France is much more willing to go on strike. And going on strike is really the only thing that has ever worked in this kind of situation. To
Actually,
put pressure on the bourgeoisie.
Weren't there strikes among French farmers, I think in the beginning of 2016 or late 2015?
It's about the labor law that was passed by the so-called Socialist Party.
I think more than anything, like, I don't think that this is so much like Trump is essentially gonna basically send like some sort of energy and echo that wasn't already there to begin with, but Trump is very much a reflection like of this sort of like pent up anger that is happening all across the world with like in regards to like the atomization of the working class, globalization, austerity. And what sucks is that it doesn't seem like at this point there is necessarily like any sort of end to this. But I do think though, like out of this, we might be able to start to see some more creative ways of being able to actually create resistance against all of this tide. And like that's mattered for us socialists of being able to like really provide those clear alternatives and different ways of thinking of politics, and even more so actually getting out there, organizing, going on strike, all of that.
At this point, I think economic pressure is the only thing that the upper classes are going to listen to. All you can really do is go on strike. Debating them is pointless at this point.
If that's not a lesson learned from the American election, I don't know what will tell liberals that you can't argue with that.
What effect, generally, would you speculate that a Trump presidency is going to have on social movements like Black Lives Matter, or specifically Black Lives Matter, especially regarding the sort of people he's going to be appointing to prominent positions, in particular Supreme Court Justice.
I don't think it's so much that he's going to be hard on them. I think it's just that under his leadership, the federal government is just going to look the other way when state, local governments are hard on them. Just basically what the federal government did before the Civil Rights Act was passed.
I think the biggest issue here is an issue that we've already started to see, is that Trump has given assholes permission to be assholes. You've already seen that. Like, there was a Republican lawmaker very recently who groped a woman and said that he did not have to be politically correct anymore as an argument for why he was allowed to do it, citing Donald Trump, basically. And I think you're going to see a similar sort of thing happen in regards to the police force, where they will start using violence more openly because they feel like no one above is watching them. They don't have to worry about the federal government, prosecuting them for excessive use of violence.
Because they won't. I would be very, very surprised if Jeff Sessions brings court cases against police departments for using violence against protesters.
I mean, I think what needs to be said as well, in terms of like what a Trump presidency would do to social movements, like, I mean, for one, I feel like this, like, it also depends on like the goals of the social movements as well. And then, I mean, on a even more perhaps like simpler basis, like how effective these movements are at defending workers and oppressed groups like people of color, queer people, women, because if ultimately a lot of these movements are ineffective, then why would the government necessarily like do anything to really try to curtail this? I feel like to see like action from the government about these, like, that's a question of like, well, what are these movements like going to do? And in some sense, like, I feel like there is a hesitancy sometimes perhaps with the more liberal movements to like really try to take it that step further and like really question the system at hand.
The other side of this is that Donald Trump election has also put a tremendous amount of energy into these movements that wasn't present when Obama was in the White House. Right, because when he was in the White House, there was a lot of people who may have been sympathetic to, say, Black Lives Matter or, like, Standing Rock, but thought along the lines of, well, my guys are the ones in office, so there's no reason for me to be protesting, right? We have friends in high places. Well, now all those friends are gone, right? So if you actually care about these things, you have no choice but to get out in the streets, unless you live in a blue state.
Could we see, like, a rise in, I don't know really the term, but, like, I want to say, like, antisocial movements, so, like, white is right kind of people, and feeling like their guys in so they can be out in the open and, parades and whatnot.
You've already started to see that to a degree.
Yeah, there was supposed to be an armed anti-Jewish march in Montana that ended up getting delayed. Presumably
Honestly,
delayed until it could happen after the inauguration.
At this point in time, it's been mostly a show. Obviously, there's been actual genuine violence against whatever marginalized group you have. But I feel like when it comes to an organized movement like Whitefish, Montana, or whatever the KKK tries to do, like march-wise in like North Carolina, I think we'll have to see that later in the year, or even just later in the term in general.
I think it was one of the comrades on here that pointed out to me fairly recently that up and down the East Coast, there have been several Jewish community centers that have had bomb threats called in to get them shut down for a couple of days or whatever.
Yeah, that was yesterday, I think.
It wasn't just the one. It wasn't just the one.
It was all over the country, too. I think there were some on the East Coast as well, but just given where the community lies, it's almost all in the Mid-Atlantic.
Well, it's not just Jews either. There's a hate crime in my own hometown against a Muslim man.
That is true. Like how Trump, in a lot of ways, is like kind of allowed these sort of like really reactionary and hateful groups to just arise. I think a question that should be asked as well is the movements, like what are and like what should the movements to actually protect oppressed groups and marginalized groups going to do, in a sense, to like really defend that and like really start to fight for that, or I mean fight for women's rights, queer rights, and also on the basis of economic class as well, fighting for like things like Medicare for all, and of course, we would probably want to take a step further and into socialism, even though I feel like in some sense we're, in terms of just like the overall class consciousness, we're a bit away from that. But I think that is something to note, is like, how are we going to fight against these forces? What are the goals that we're going to strive for, and how are we going to get there?
I would sort of say in response to that, from my perspective, that really calls into question the orientation of an organisation. What an organisation really should be serving as in this situation is a centre around which all of these social movements can coalesce, because they're going to have to, essentially, to push progress through. Obviously, class cooperation is going to be necessary, class unity, which necessitates an organisation that understands actually that the class itself, the working class, is not homogeneous. It is actually composed of these groups, essentially. So, to me, that's really a crucial question in determining what we should be doing as socialists in that situation. From where I am, the answer, at least in part, would appear to be making sure you're orienting yourself towards those social movements as well as a class perspective in general.
And I would absolutely agree with you there, and I think that's like the right orientation to have.
I'll just put forward a thought experiment. Let's imagine that Trump goes through with his protectionist policies. I mean, there's no guarantee that he will, but let's just imagine that he sticks to the idea of imposing very high taxes on what he calls Chinese goods, which aren't really Chinese goods. They're being made for American corporations. They're just being made in China. And let's just say that hypothetically it has the intended effect, or the promised effect, of keeping manufacturing in the USA. The result of that is going to be an inevitable drive to avoid paying US wages, paying a US minimum wage, especially at a time when there are movements everywhere for a $15 minimum wage. And to me, it seems entirely possible, if all those conditions are met, and again, there is no guarantee that they will be, that there will be a knock-on drive towards increasing prison labour in as many different sectors as possible, because let's just call it what it is, it's modern day slavery. And that's one way, and really the only way, to sidestep having to pay a minimum wage. It's either going to be prison labour, or it's going to be super exploited immigrant workers.
I think you're correct in that, supposing it works, which is, I mean, my only issue with the whole line of thinking is that it's a chain of about 3 or 4 different assumptions that are all pretty long shots. First, that he actually goes through with it. Second, that it works. And third, that people would actually feel right with the idea of, putting all those new jobs that are supposed to be coming back to the United States through just the prison system. If all that did happen, and I honestly don't even think the second would happen, I think it would cause severe outrage across the board. But moreover, Donald Trump is a man who has gone on the record to say that the minimum wage in the United States is too high, and that the United States can't compete with, or the United States workers cannot compete with workers in Southeast Asia, for example. So I'd be more concerned about the Republican Congress trying to push for reducing the minimum wage.
There might be an interesting divergence between blue states that pay high wages for service work and red states that pay lower wages but have primarily industrial and resource extraction work.
There's another point to that where, assuming it's successful in terms of keeping jobs in the US, and in the other hypothetical situation where those manufacturing jobs were not just farmed out to prisoners, and you actually had American workers doing those jobs and there was a drive to lower wages, the problem then you would have is that those workers producing all of those commodities would not be able to afford those commodities on their wages. So in order for them to be able to afford those commodities, they would have to push for a raise in their wages, and the result of that would be that the price goes up again. And you just have this continuous vicious cycle that essentially is going to result in the acceleration of crisis.
That's essentially what happened in the 1970s.
It's readily apparent that no matter what happens, the system is doomed. So, unless we found the bottom rung of our economy on the backs of practical slaves, the capitalist system as it's written right now just isn't going to work with relying on a huge amount of cheap knickknacks being produced locally. It's just, it can't happen.
And I think to be said, too, is that even if the capitalist system did do something that awful of moving pretty much all industrialized jobs into the prison system and therefore try to jack up the numbers of how many prisoners you have, much more than what we already have, in that sense, you now just, when workers as they currently stand are fairly atomized, now you just put them all together where they can much more easily interact. And even as you can see it now, where prisoners have been able to actually strike and basically not do work. I'm not exactly sure how long the prison strikes lasted. It seemed to have lasted for a really long time. But that is also just one more thing that would basically put even more so the economy to its knees.
I think there's another point here to make, and that is just the sheer impossibility of it all. When you look at it, the number of people currently employed in China is around 770 million people, which is more than double the current total population of the United States. So even if we were to bring a fraction of those jobs back, and of course it's not going to be all 770 million people producing stuff in the United States, but the point being that there are more people working in China than there are people in the United States, and there's only a smaller fraction of the people in the United States that are actually working. And most of those jobs, even if you had 100% employment in the United States, most of those jobs would still have to be in China or somewhere else.
The other angle of this is that these protectionist measures are going to have really, really nasty side effects in the countries that currently make our goods. Not just in China, but in Mexico, too.
Yep.
I think Mexico is actually going to be one of the pretty much ground zero for post-Trump economic downturn. Well, it's already happening,
Yeah.
I suppose the question is, if not China and Mexico, then where? Where is it likely that if these tariffs really do go through, where is manufacturing going to move?
Even if all the manufacturing that we could fill came to the United States, like if every person in the United States who wanted and could perform manufacturing jobs had manufacturing jobs, there would not be a sufficient number of them to fill the demand for manufacturing labor in the United States. So you'd have to assume, if Donald Trump is actually being serious about what he's talking about, he would be not necessarily completely cutting off the trade relationship that we have with China and Mexico, but as he said before, cancel the trade deal we currently have and renegotiate something better. What that actually means, I have no idea. Obviously, it can mean whatever the hell he wants it to mean. But presumably, it's an almost sure thing that for the most part, not much is going to change.
How do we feel that socialist organisations or social movements are positioned right now in relation to Trump in terms of their relative strength? Obviously, everything is always in motion, so it's never a question of sort of comparing these two things as though they're static. I mean, to point it out, ACAB has said not well. Essentially, socialist organisations are not in a good position comparatively. But at the same time, we are seeing a wave of radicalisation at the moment, like mass radicalisation. We're seeing people joining organisations that haven't been involved in politics before. The socialist organisations are growing faster than they have in decades.
I feel a little bit overly cynical, and this might just be my own bias from the fact that I'm in a Marxist organization right now. But like, the thing is, it's like, what we got to see is more and more people just simply have not been able to engage in struggle at all, specifically class struggle, right? It's been harder and harder to do, which is why I feel you see that basically a lot of Marxist and socialist organizations like really started to lose strength over the past 40 some years. That being said, though, like right now, I mean, specifically talking about socialist alternative in the United States, we're now at a point where we're at over 1,000 members throughout the entire country right now. And a lot of that actually wasn't even necessarily from the movement for Bernie stuff. A lot of that was actually from a lot of this anti-Trump stuff. And the momentum for people like joining us seems to actually be really growing. So now it's the question of like, well, they see something wrong with the system and they want to be re-engaged in struggle. So it's like at this point right now for a lot of Marxist and socialist groups is to like really start to like re-engage people in that struggle and really start to provide context and education for a lot of this, because like in a lot of ways it's like this memory of the working class has just been so completely lost throughout, and it's like really hard for many people to really see what the hell is going on. And I think in a lot of ways like Marxist groups can really start to fill in that gap of being in a way the sort of like just kind of like educator on the theory at the very least, but also like providing those alternatives of like what can really strike at the heart of the capitalist class and like really start to bring an end to all of this bullshit that's been happening right now.
Yeah, I think in the 1980s, there was a very, subtle, I guess, campaign to demobilize the American public and remove the American public as a political force from politics. And this is done a variety of ways. One of the big ones is ending the draft. And I think we have to sort of work around that, and we have to, as a class, we have to relearn how to do politics in the first place. which is why people like to criticize movements like Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. But I think that it's important that we go through these growing pains because we have to relearn all the stuff that we lost, because there hasn't been a legitimate grassroots proletarian movement in this country for 40 years.
I definitely agree, and I feel like, in some sense, for me, I feel like that I feel like I have a little bit more optimism in terms of the role of like socialist and Marxist organizations in like really re-engaging the working class and struggle. Like from what I've seen, just like personally for what we do in our organization, like we're I mean, you can see it in Seattle right now, where basically we were able to work. Socialist Alternative was able to work with tenant organizations to basically, I mean, now that like there's starting to like trickle out, so like tenant bills of rights, where it's like now like basically like the initial cost of like moving into an apartment, like the security deposit and then like the fees together has to equal the first month of rent, and you also have to be provided a 6-month payment period for that, which I mean, just that alone, because the initial cost of like even moving into any sort of city is just so astronomical, and is just one of those things that like really, really drives gentrification. And you wouldn't have gotten this with Democrats. You got this with socialists who were able to like mobilize people. And I feel like you can see also other examples like that in Ireland as well, of that same sort of engagement of socialist groups working with the working class to engage them in these sorts of struggles, like with the fight against water charges.
And I do want to say that I think that right now the radical left is the only movement in this country that still has any kind of moral authority to criticize people like Donald Trump right now. The Democrats themselves have just completely dropped the ball. They lost an election that should have been a walk-in for them. And they did it mainly by actively rejecting and criticizing the quasi-radicalism of Bernie Sanders. I'm not calling him an actual radical, mind you, but near enough that when the Democrats reject him, they're rejecting everything to the left of them. And that cost them so much, and it made it clear that they're not on the side of the working class. And at this point, the only alternative that can strongly critique the right from the left is the radical left.
And I think that's like just even speaks more so to why the re-engagement of the working class in struggle and finding ways to be able to do that and like really start to bring like solidarity throughout all sections of the working class together is because like without that, in a lot of ways, like, I mean, I remember even talking to some liberals just about like Brexit and stuff, and like there were a lot of socialists that were, pushing sort of like basically Lexit, right? Where it's like we want to get out of the EU, because the EU is ultimately, and I mean, there's really no arguing this, I feel, that the EU is a capitalist institution, and it pretty much like all it does is like facilitate the movement of capital like throughout the European Union, or whoever's a member of the European Union. But the thing is as well, it's like when you're not engaged in that struggle, well, you think, okay, well, the thing is we need the kind of politics that we need to be like really focused on is sort of like, okay, well, what are the ruling leaders and like the politicians that we voted in going to do for us, which is, I feel that's like one of those places where you start to even see people like, especially some really hardcore liberals who have contempt for the radical left, of basically thinking that like we're this sort of irresponsible group. And that's why it's like we really need to be skillful in terms of like how really, I mean, that state of mind is wrong, but also skillful in being able to show how struggle works pretty much.
So let's talk about J20 for a moment. What do we hope to see happen tomorrow or as a result of tomorrow's demonstrations?
I'm actually a bit nervous about J20, to be honest. I don't think enough was done to really promote the event or to kind of talk about why something like this should happen.
Yeah, I think with J20, well, I think it's still good to like push, and for anyone that's listening right now, it's like you should definitely try to find out whether there's a local march going on right now. Like any sorts of solidarity that you can have in those marches is like very much, it's only going to add fuel to the fire, and I'd very much encourage anyone to do that. But I do think, just overall in terms of like pushing for, like, people were calling on for a general strike. Well, that's a bit confusing because really unions can call for general strikes. And the thing is, like, if you actually did try to just like leave work without like any one of your comrades leaving with you, then like that can put you in a lot of trouble. So in a sense, like the framing of this as this sort of like big sort of like flare up of anger, I mean, we're just going to have to wait and see what actually happens. But really what I'm looking much more forward to is the day after with the Women's March, where this actually does seem like at least some sort of symbolic gesture that there might be some sort of re-engagement in many different struggles like women's reproductive rights, racial equality, also, fighting for things like a living wage and Medicare for all and whatnot. I feel like that's really what we should really be focusing on, and seeing how we can like direct that energy more from that into future struggles that are going to help us defend against a lot of this probably coming austerity that's going to happen.
As a counterpoint to your pessimism, the Facebook event I just linked is the march in Los Angeles has 30,000 people that say they're going to be there.
Oh shit! Well, that's a very good thing.
I'm just hoping Oakland has a good protest for J20, because Lord knows if any city in the entire country is going to lead a damn good protest, it's going to be Oakland.
Oakland is the birthplace of the revolution.
It really is, like, unironically.
I would say this to keep in mind, that the key problem with protest in America right now is that for a huge, huge percentage of the American population, the difference between steady state living on and homelessness is one paycheck. And that suppresses the ability for the working class to be active in this kind of way.
The only precedent for the kind of mass movement that I think people really wanted to see is the 2003 anti-war protests.
So I just looked up right now, specifically socialist alternatives. I think this is also in like coalition with like a DSA and other groups. Like right now, this specific one, because I think there's going to be like actually a lot of events happening on Friday, and like the big one happening on like 5 p.m. is like, so there's 1,200,000 people interested, although 3.5 thousand people are going, and 9.4 thousand people are invited. So I guess like take that what you will in terms of like what's happening in New York City. That is something that is like kind of relieving to hear, though, that it's like, this isn't just, a place, like this general strike just gonna happen in like DC. Like it's going to happen all across the country, which I think is a very powerful thing.
But you have to remember that not everyone who's going to go to these things RSVPs on Facebook or even hears about it on Facebook.
That's a good point. That absolutely is a good point.
And of course, not everyone who RSVPs ends up going.
So I guess it's just at this point, in terms of January 20th, that's a wait and see thing. But I think January 21st, because I think there's like right now, for the Women's March in like DC, like there's like over 100,000 people that are said to be going, and there's already a bunch of solidarity marches as well, like one also in New York City, and I'd imagine in pretty much everywhere else in the country, there's going to be solidarity marches. But I feel like that's the one like that we should like really look towards, because I think like how well that goes is going to also point to, in some sense, like the kind of sustained resistance that we're going to be seeing in the coming years.
Women's March in LA has 70,000 attending, 70,000 interested.
You can't see like J20 or something like as a definitive moment at all, but it is like good in keeping just the momentum. An actual kind of definitive moment for anything would have to come like during the presidency, sort of when like this actual policy is happening instead of just him getting into it.
One thing that I think might be interesting about the January 20th protests is it'll be a good litmus test for kind of Trump's reactions in general to people. I mean, he's shown to himself to be thin-skinned and vindictive, and absolutely, if anyone contradicts him or calls him names or whatever, even the little fingers comment, he's reacted in full force with all of his tweeting capabilities. So to see in an actual like event where he responds might be interesting.
What is the legacy of the movement for Bernie Sanders and his presidential campaign?
I suppose there are some down ballot knock-on effects that have gotten a few people that are somewhat further to the left than the usual slew of Democrats into some local offices. I know for a fact that here in Austin that a member of the Democratic Socialists of America won an election, for what it's worth. And I suppose that's a positive thing. I think Bernie Sanders has paved the way to it, one degree or another, for the radicalization of a good portion of people, but they're not quite there yet.
I think it's going to take some time to shake out, because the transformation, and I think the parallel for what's going to happen in the Democratic Party is the Tea Party after Obama's election, and it took a long time for that movement to really start disrupting the Republican Party. Like not until 2009, 2010 did you really start to see a major shift in the base that led to hard right people winning elections. 2018 is going to be the year for the Bernie-crats.
I think, if anything, what Bernie represents is this sort of re-engagement with a lot of people in the political process, and then in turn, also in some sense trying to re-engage them in struggle as well, which I think is the most important thing. I think what really like sucks about this, and Bernie's going to have to own up to a lot of this, is that he really tried to funnel a lot of that energy like right back into the Democratic Party with this sort of like weird super PAC, like our revolution and stuff, where it's almost like the way our revolution like was structured like seemed almost completely antithetical to like the entire campaign, and like what a lot of people were really moved by, where he didn't take any sort of like dark corporate cash. He was taking cash from regular people on small donations and like small and also unions as well. And
if there's anything to say that might not necessarily absolve him, but at least give a perspective of a degree of understanding, Bernie Sanders was scared, and rightfully so, that Donald Trump was going to win that election.
Yeah, like how a lot of people were really scared. If anything, like their support of Hillary was pretty much out of like damage control pretty much, where they saw that like Hillary Clinton wasn't really like that great of a candidate to begin with, but because she wasn't Trump and that otherwise it would be the status quo, while like still not great and, you know, actually in a lot of ways really not good, there a lot of people didn't want the uncertainty that a Trump presidency brings and is actually bringing right now. And I think this is more kind of like maybe looking a little bit ahead, is sort of, okay, like what's Bernie going to do next? And you sort of see this now where he's like, you know, now he's part of like the Democrats like outreach you know, committee, and he's you know, he's been organizing a lot of these rallies about like the need to keep Obamacare and stuff. I mean, what sucks is that this is also spearheaded by Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, who have really have not been at all on the forefront of like having any sort of like real meaningful like healthcare fight at all. I'm not exactly sure what roles they had to play in, you know, basically like gutting the public option that was originally going to be a part of the Affordable Care Act. But I mean, you know, their reputation has shown that it's like they do not mind taking corporate cash. They do not mind basically appealing to those rich constituents more than the working class, really, in terms of how they're going to like bring forward policy. And that's something that's really unfortunate, and it's just like I would hope that later on, like, I mean, the most hopeful thing is that Bernie Sanders like would break with the Democrats. I mean, that's something like we've always been trying to say, that he should have run it as an independent. I even remember having a conversation with a comrade where he was trying to point out that in a lot of sense right now, if like I think it was like even one of his staffers that was trying to say, like, if he ran as an independent, in some sense, Bernie Sanders could have been the new Abraham Lincoln, in the sense, not necessarily, you know, in the sense that Bernie Sanders ends slavery, but like in the sense that like the way the Republican arose was when like the that particular two-party system was about to collapse on both ends, and a new party was able to emerge out of that.
What can people do to fight back throughout the Trump presidency?
I would say personally, it has never been a more important time right now to like join an organization and really start to engage in the struggle. I feel like at this point, right now, unfortunately, a lot of social forces, especially against Trump, are in the defensive. But I do feel like that this does bring us an opportunity to like really rebuild a lot of those infrastructures of solidarity in like between sections of the working class. So like more than anything, get out there, organize. Like reading a lot of the theory is obviously very good. It gives a lot of context into like what we're talking about, but the thing that like really solidifies that in terms of like your how like in terms of your radicalization is engaging in class struggle, and that's really is what I feel is going to help us like really get out of this mess, not only of Trump but of the system itself, and of, you know, of capitalism, of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all of it. So that's my advice.
I agree with what you said. Join an organization, a local organization. If there's not a local organization, contact a national organization and see if you can get a few comrades to help you found a local organization based on the national one.
And I think what needs to be said too is like with these organizations is that like, you know, we're all learning as well, and you will learn when you come in and engage in struggle. So if you're like nervous about like, you know, that you're not going to be able to do maybe certain actions or something like that, good organizations can be flexible and like really help find your place in like the ways that you can help out, because any little bit of help in engaging in class struggle helps. It really does.
I was just wondering, based around joining some sort of organization, whether or not there was like some sort of option for not only students but also like those who aren't 18 yet.
A lot of high school students are probably going to be walking out on Inauguration Day, at least in the LA Unified School District.
Most student branches of organisations are also youth wings, and Socialist Alternative, I believe, has just rolled out Socialist students nationally. You could check to see if they're already in your area.
I do want to say to that that with contacting specifically socialist students and Socialist Alternative, is that as far as I'm aware, like I'm not speaking for Socialist Alternative officially. Like, there is some backup, and it might take a little bit of a while, but I mean, just that backup, right, tells you that there are people that really are starting to want to engage in this sort of struggle. And I would even say it's like, if you really want to, and you're in high school, right, start a club, start talking about these sorts of things, try to find a teacher that wants to discuss or like basically sponsor a club that discusses politics in this way.
There are also action groups based around campaigning on specific issues. So if there are no socialist groups in your area, it might be worth your while to join one of those.
I know there's a number of Fight for 15 groups. I question how left-leaning they are, but it's something.
I should also point out that we really can't just kind of stick to hanging around with other socialists. We should actually be engaging non-socialists in these discussions as well.
I mean, it's the case of the Fight for 15 is eventually going to turn into the Fight for 20 or the Fight for 25.
And then the fight to end wage labor.
Also, when you're in school, it's a good time to think about becoming familiar with some Marxist theory, because it's really important to understand how capitalism works, what our critiques of capitalism are, in order to know how we should go about dismantling it.
I think what's useful as well, if you want to learn theory, is to also try to apply a lot of the concepts that you've learned into the real world, and try to see how it actually how it really works in the real world. And I feel like that's one way to really kind of get the gist of how the theory contextualizes the world in your head. And also always remain critical and always question, the reason why we've got here is because we have been able to keep a critical eye and question a lot of things and a lot of preconceptions about how the world works, human nature and all of that. And a lot of that too, when you do engage in activism and in struggle, will really solidify that a lot of those radical conclusions, and it will also inform basically how you're going to act too, because you'll know a lot of this theory and you'll know the goals that you'll strive for, and that really is really what helps you figure out a game plan for all of this too.
We've come to the end of our discussion. I would just like to thank everyone who contributed, and I'd like to send a message of solidarity to all of our American comrades who are protesting against Trump's inauguration tomorrow on January 20th. I would urge any listeners, find out what's happening in your area and get involved.
Чем